We teach people to live by a guiding question. We say it's just simple to ask, what does love require of me in this situation?
Thanks for joining us here on the Faith Ignited channel. I am Michael Bridges, Executive Pastor at Faith Ignited, and I am with
Aaron Chivington,
our Senior Pastor.
with you, Michael.
Aaron, you too. Thank you. Love answering questions. Please continue to send in your questions. We love tackling them, and gives us a chance to do a little research and make sure we get all of our information.
Yeah, we really do enjoy the research part of it.
We really do. We really spend some time to try to answer these in the most informed way that we can, and of course accurate. So Aaron, here's our question today. Pretty simple. We've been talking about the Gospels lately, and some of our questions. So here's a question about the Gospels. Were the Gospels written before 100 AD?
Yeah.
And this is an important question.
Yeah, it's important because if they're not, then what you can do is you can begin to insert a time gap that allows for mythology. Because eyewitnesses that would have said, hey, that didn't happen, have died off.
Yes.
And so now we can exaggerate the story and exaggerate it again to the point where, hey, the story no longer is actually what it started off with.
Maybe like today, we could make up stories about the Civil War because no one's alive from the Civil War to counter that.
Right, right. Or I like to tell people, the fish I caught was that big. Unless I'm sitting there with someone who was with me and they're like, it was more like this.
Right.
All right. So here's the quick, kind of simple version of how do we know the gospel authors are written before 180? All right. So a couple pieces of detail. First of all, there are no academic scholars who think the gospels were written after 180. And so what you have is this, the question comes out of a culture that really hasn't studied this. There's no academic scholar that thinks they're written after 180. In fact, most of them will put them up to within 20 to 30 years of Jesus' life. And the Gospel of Mark maybe as early as within 15. So I'm going to give dates that are at the extreme liberal end. That way we're safe.
Yeah.
And so there's always this kind of time range, like, hey, from 40 to 50. Right, that we can give, and again, the liberal time frame, and I don't mean that in a political sense, I mean that in a scholarly sense.
Yes.
The liberal side would say, okay, 50, the more conservative would say, hey, around 40. So here's two key pieces that are missing in every gospel that give us an early date. The destruction of the temple in Israel. That happens in 69 and 70 AD. The Jews revolt in 66 against the Roman Empire. There's a war that goes on, and Rome comes in and destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, ultimately burns it, removes the stones, so all we have is what's now known as the Wailing Wall, the West Wall.
West Wall.
So Rome comes in, destroys that, 69, 70 AD. What's missing in every gospel is the destruction of the temple. Now, there's at moments where we have some illusion that where maybe John is aware of that. In fact, John probably writes actually in response to the dispersion of the Jews who fled Jerusalem, who now have gone, we have no home, the temple is destroyed, our God's been defeated, is there any hope? And so John is addressing, and that's part of the reason why John stops and he writes and goes, let me remind you some things about Jesus that the other three gospel authors didn't have. And he starts out with, how big is our God? In the beginning was the Word became flesh. So again, there's this huge God who is still in control for John.
Yeah.
Now, the other gospel authors, all writing before them. And part of why this is fascinating is the destruction of the temple. Remember, life centered around the temple.
Yes, yes.
Everything centered around. You and I can't overstate this. There's nothing in our culture that is as big as that. It would be like a newspaper not mentioning the World Trade Center blew up on 9/11. Like, hey, planes flew into it, but we're going to totally ignore that, right? Especially because Jesus did what? He actually predicted the destruction of the temple. And that is recorded in all the Gospels. And so one of the ways that you can validate that Jesus did have prophetic skills was to, oh, and by the way, last year the temple did fall down.
Yeah, you would do that if you could.
But it hadn't happened. And so therefore it's not mentioned in any of the Gospels. The second way is to actually understand a little bit of the chronology of history. So we have the destruction of the temple, and then we have Paul. And what's interesting about that is that Paul's traveling companion is Luke, the physician Luke, who's recording, again, in the book of Acts, the life of Paul and Peter. Well, we know that both Paul and Peter are martyred under Nero's rule in AD 62, 63, 64 at the latest, but probably 62, 63. Here's what we know. Acts ends with Paul in jail and Peter doing okay. If the book that you're writing is about those two main characters and the beginning of the church, and they are martyred, you're going to write that.
Absolutely.
But what we have in Acts is Paul's in jail, Peter's doing okay.
That's where it ends.
And that's where it ends. Instead of, and they marched Paul up the temple steps, and there he was beheaded. Again, we don't have any of that story. So what we have is that Acts doesn't record the ending, which means those guys are still alive. Acts is the second volume of the two-volume set because Acts was written by Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke.
Yes.
So we know that, therefore, Acts is written and distributed somewhere before the 60s, which now backs up Luke, because there's no computer or printer press, into the 50s at least. Luke uses both Matthew and Mark as source material, along with other eyewitnesses. That's what he says at the beginning. Other people have undertaken this work. I went back and researched eyewitnesses, Theophilus, to give you an accurate account. So that puts Matthew and Mark at least in the early 50s, if not 40s. Well, we know that Matthew uses Mark, and so again, you just keep backing that up. All right? And so you have this date where by the time you get to the Gospel of Mark, you could be in the 40s.
Yeah.
Maybe the 50s still.
With Jesus having been crucified and risen, AD 33?
Probably 30.
30?
Right? Because remember, Jesus was actually born probably around 5 or 6 BC.
Yeah.
And so if you get 30 years of his life, you end up around 30 AD, not 33 AD.
Yes.
And so, yeah, you're within 10 to 15 years of Jesus' life, death, resurrection. And not enough time for myths to creep into the story.
Right.
But because there's eyewitnesses everywhere who not only could have shut down the message of Jesus, but would have loved to. In fact, what you see it from Paul is, as a guy who was trying to kill the message of Jesus, his argument was never, this isn't true. His argument was just, don't say it, I'm going to kill you.
Right.
I'm going to lock you in jail. I'm going to persecute you. Why? Because the evidence was there that the tomb was empty. It wasn't, this is false information. We have the reasons we can prove you're wrong. And believe me, not just Paul, but the Jewish council, everybody who wanted to stay in the old system would have loved to have shut down this message and proven it to be a lie. But they could not.
Right. Because
the evidence for the empty tomb was overwhelming. In fact, we know that the story they make up is the disciples somehow overpowered the guards and stole the body, which is just an unbelievable story. Right? It's like the junior high basketball team went and beat USA Dream Team and beat them by like 100 points. Like the junior high basketball. Okay, that's just impossible then.
Yeah.
So that's how we get the early date of the Gospels.
Well before 100.
Well before 100. And again, there's details in them that you had to have been there to know, and all kinds of scholarly work. And again, no academic scholar. No academic scholar. Say it again, no academic scholar. Again, this stuff comes out of kind of conspiracy world. Actually would tell you, hey, the Gospels aren't written until long after. Now we have the non-canonical Gospels, which are, but again, the 4 Gospels we have are all written before probably 90, 80.
Yeah. Aaron, great explanation, great facts. Thank you. So thanks for joining us here at Faith Ignited channel. Check us out on our website at faithignited.church. Also like our YouTube and Facebook page and join us at church on Sunday. Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys.